Hi, I'm Ross Nethery with Sports Business Journal here at the 2022 SBJ Thought Leaders Retreat at the beautiful Broadmoor in Colorado Springs. I'm here with Jim Cavale of Influencer to talk about some of the big issues in college sports. And Jim, one of the biggest is NIL and all of the rapid changes that are going on in that space. What are your thoughts on the current state of the NIL landscape?
Well, first of all, Ross, thanks for having me and this amazing group. Kudos to you, SBJ, Abe, the team. I mean, what an event. Colorado Springs, the Broadmoor, it's been amazing, and I've made some amazing connections with some beautiful human beings here, so thank you for that. NIL is one of those spaces that was speculated on so much leading up to 2021, July 1st, when it all happened. The reality is all the speculation was wrong, right? We thought the NCAA was going to set one set of rules for everyone to adhere to. Alston case gave them too much liability to do that. So then we had not just states making rules, but every school has their own policy. So we have no regulatory uniformity, which has caused a lot of issues. And so I think, the reality is there's two NILs. There's the NIL that we all predicted would happen, which is traditional NIL, we'll call it, where awesome things are happening for athletes to exercise their name, image, and likeness, to sign autographs or do endorsements on social media or start their own t-shirt line or monetize content on platforms like TikTok or YouTube and make money. And it's really fun to see the entrepreneurial spirit that's being pulled out of athletes while they still have the jersey, and people will still return their phone calls or their emails or their DMs, and they can build a business. Then there's the non-traditional NIL, and that's the collectives. So that's where boosters, donors, supporters of the programs of these really well-supported collegiate athletic organizations and brands are pooling money together to find creative ways to pay athletes, mainly for things like appearances where they can show up to a dinner or a birthday party. Still an exchange of their NIL, but it's a little different than what we've seen at the pro level. And a lot of money is being thrown on the collective side, the non-traditional side, because of FOMO. Coaches are worried of losing recruits or losing current players to go into the portal and go to another school. But I think the reality is that will die down. A lot of boosters and donors are going to throw a lot of money that they're going to see might not adhere or equal the value that the player is going to equal on the field. I mean, that's just 18 to 22-year-old kids. And they're going to see that same money could be used to have a building in their name or have a scholarship fund in their name. And so I think that the traditional NIL is the greater future of what we're going to see. But like every new market, it needs to kind of settle and set. And that's really the biggest thing that needs to happen. Understanding an athlete's value, whether it's the athlete understanding their own value or schools, people who want to spend money with athletes understanding their value for particular deliverables, is something that will happen naturally over time.
How long of a time span are you looking at for this to level set the way you expect it to?
I think it's going to take another 24 months at least. The data that comes from actual payments for NIL deals to student athletes is going to help create intelligence to understand what brands are going to pay athletes for endorsements based on what influence they have on social, based on what role or performance they have on the field, what exposure they have in the market they play in. These are all things that need to be understood by the athlete and by anyone who wants to pay them. And whether it's a brand in the example I gave, or whether it's an autograph signing, or whether it's a merchandise business, whether it's group licensing, which still hasn't fully taken flight in NIL. I mean, you could make an argument that in a couple years, every athlete playing in March Madness will have 5 different ways they automatically make money just because their team made March Madness. That's not in place yet. And so a lot of the evolution that needs to happen for value to be understood and for systems like those group licensing opportunities and even individual opportunities to be valued properly is just going to take data, performance, actuals, not just a bunch of projections. And so I think it's going to take a couple of years. And what's funny is a lot of people say it's going to take a couple of years, but they lean more on the regulatory side. In a couple of years, the federal government will set one set of NIL rules. And I just wouldn't hold your breath if you're in college athletics for that. I would start to think now about how the data that you have, because compliance does require reporting of all NIL deals by student athletes in the NIL policies at every school, how does that data really help student athletes understand their value so they don't undersell themselves, but also help anyone who wants to pay them for an NIL opportunity or transaction properly value the athlete?
So NIL is one of the big stories in college sports everyone's talking about. Conference realignment is another
Yeah.
big story. I'm interested in your thoughts on how did NIL affect conference realignment at all, and how might conference realignment affect NIL?
You know, one thing that I think is really interesting is conference realignment is happening at the same time as the rewriting of the NCAA's constitution, right? The rules. And so for the first time, we're finally having discussions around, like, you know, Alabama and Binghamton are both Division I, but they're much different, right? I mean, Alabama and my hometown team, Syracuse, are both Power 5, and they're very different, right? So, like, how can we get you know, similar collegiate athletic brands to compete in the same level of competition, whether that's conference realignment, whether that's a super division, or whatever comes of the transformation committee's work with my good friend Greg Sankey and Julie Cromer doing awesome work on that. But it's hard for them to complete their project because they don't know what it's all going to look like. When they started their project, UCLA and USC were still in the Pac-12, you know. So it's just a really fast-moving time. What I do think conference realignment has to do with NIL is if there was a way for commissioners to get the states that the schools in their league participate in to have more of a uniform set of policy, so that the conference could have one set of NIL rules, that would create a lot of great things. Number one, if a conference had their own NIL rules, so just take the SEC. The SEC had one set of NIL rules that all 16 schools said, that's going to be our school policy too. It creates a level playing field with NIL across the SEC. It creates the opportunity to have all the reporting come into a centralized database for all of the SEC. So now Nick Saban's not worried that Jimbo Fisher did a $32 million class. Like, you could just see the transparency is there with one database. And then on top of that, now group licensing can happen within a conference, which is huge for everything from a Bose headphones deal to a Panini trading card deal to an EA Sports video game. So instead of trying to think so broad as all of Division I or all of FBS, I think the conference picture of a dozen to 20 schools could create regulatory uniformity, a much easier way to track all the deals and have transparency, use that data to better value athletes so that their value set, and create group licensing paths that don't currently exist.
I think one of the concerns, as people have thought about NIL over the years, was that it would change the face of college athletics. And I think most people would agree that given the money that's at stake, it's only fair for college athletes to share in some of the value that they are creating. But how does college sports continue to differentiate itself from just professional sports as we continue down this road?
Yeah, when I decided to exit my previous business and start building Influencer, I wrote this transitional manifesto just as an exercise for myself, like a thesis of an MBA. I wanted to write, like, kind of where college sports was and some comparable industries that I could associate it with. We heard a great futurist talk this morning here at the Thought Leaders event in Colorado Springs, and he said that hindsight plus insight equals foresight. And I think the hindsight here is music. Streaming was not embraced by the music executives in the late 90s when Napster disrupted everything. And for almost a 10-year period, artists missed out on a lot of their value because the labels that they signed with didn't embrace streaming and have their own streaming platforms. Instead, what did they do? They went on anti-piracy tirades for almost a decade and took Steve Jobs outside of music, coming in, figuring out, hey, we all can win here. And if these labels just would have embraced streaming, the apps might not be called Spotify and Apple Music. It might be called Columbia Streaming and et cetera, right? And so we're kind of in the same exact situation here. This has been going on since, the early 2000s. First of all, social media put a lot of power in the hands of the athlete. And there's nothing, once that happened, that you could do to take that away. Gave them a direct line to fans and brands that want to pay them. Second of all, there's a lot of inflation of salaries that just made everybody blush and say, geez, is this right? And those two things, along with many others, court cases in the Supreme Court like O'Bannon and Alston and other things, combined to get us here. We got to stop talking about what happened and let that hindsight play into insight so we can set the foresight for the future when it comes to collegiate athletics. And that is, you can still have an opportunity for athletes to have cost of attendance checks and educator-related benefits that they perform well in the classroom, and so many wonderful, fruitful benefits from free tuition and getting free gear and a chef in the kitchen and unlimited strength coaches without them being employees and having them start to foot the bill for those expenses. And so keeping that model, but letting NIL be a way where it's icing on the cake for the athletes that want to put in that work is, in my opinion, how college sports can be different. If we move to a pay-for-play model, even for certain sports, we are going to lose the academic and other fruits that make college sports different. And so I think we got to fight to figure out our own unique model and not say, you know, it's going to be the AFC, the NFC, and the SEC.
Great foresight from someone who has been on the leading edge of all of this change in college sports. Jim Cavale of Influencer, thank you so much for joining us at the Thought Leaders Retreat.
This has been great.